Well, good morning, everybody. After a period of silence, my apologies. My life has taken a bit of a couple of curved balls since I last communicated with you. But I have sent back the worksheets 1 and 2 for the people that did submit them. And you are busy working on assignment 1. But in the meantime, time is of the essence. So I'm continuing with Ornamental Chords B. So it continues the topic of ornamental chords. In this particular case, it focuses on the dominant chord specifically. There was stuff about ornamental chords A, like the cadential 6/4 and all of those things that also pertain to the dominant chord. But there are things about ornamental chords A that don't pertain to the dominant chord, like the ornamental fifths, the passing 6/4s and all of those. So instead of having all of those different options that were in chapter 5, this is the dominant has developed its own set of ornamentations that is dealt with in this chapter that I just want to go over with you. And I'd like to start by just revisiting the concept of the emancipation of the dissonance, which you will recall Lara dealt with you in chapter 1. Chapter 1, you had reference to the composer and theorist Arnold Schoenberg, and one of the concepts that he talks about, the history of tonal music, is the history of the emancipation of the dissonance. How gradually triads, basic triads, like you have in your basic tonal sentence, chapter 2, structural harmony, those basic triads can start incorporating dissonances or non-chordal notes in a way that actually turns them into complex chords. So you did with Lara the idea of the dominant quartet, the dominant seventh, which was probably the most common example of that phenomenon. What did I do with those pages now? They are. So when you studied the dominant seventh with Lara, remember, we spoke about the fact that you could take the dominant triad, so T, Re, and then inevitably with a doubled root, so T, Re, so, and then when it resolves to the tonic, that so normally goes to Mi in the tonic chord or in the submediant chord when dominant resolves. And that very often that so, Mi, descending third is embellished with the passing note Fa. So, Fa, Mi. And that becomes such a normative dissonant. This is a dissonant interval of a seventh. That dissonance becomes so normative, it becomes almost a part of the character of this chord. So that instead of having to always justify it as a non-chordal note, eventually you can emancipate it. That means free it from its role as a non-chordal passing note, and you can make it part of the chord. So it becomes an essential part of the chord called the dominant seventh or the dominant quartet. So we are continuing with that concept now and saying it's not only the added seventh that works like that, but as you can see here, bottom of this page, you can create in that way a complex quartet with an added seventh. You can also create a quintet. Quintet means 5 notes. So instead of just so, ti, re, you can have so, ti, re, fa. And you can in fact also have so, ti, re, fa, la. The la is the appoggiatura above so. La, so. Can eventually, instead of just being a non-chordal note, appoggiatura above the doubled root, it can become an added ninth that doesn't have to resolve. It is an emancipated dissonant that becomes part of the tonic chord. And the same with a sextad. Sextad means 6 notes with an added 11th. So, ti, re, fa, is a non-chordal appoggiatura above the leading note. Do, T, which can just act as a non-chordal note, or it can eventually become emancipated and part of the chord. It doesn't have to resolve. And then the one that we want to talk about today is the septet, the 7 notes. Now remember, when you've got 7 notes, you've actually got all the notes in the scale. The scale consists of 7 notes. So you've taken so, ti, re, and you've added all the other notes in the scale. Fa, la, do, and the last one is mi. Remember, in tertium harmony, you always add them in thirds. So that's with an added 13th. And how that works, again, it's a non-chordal note embellishment of the triad. So it takes the triad, so, ti, re, and it's so, ti, re, there it is, page 152, figure B, and it embellishes the notes of the triad. So the 7th is added a passing note below so, the 9th is an appoggiatura above so, the 11th is an appoggiatura above the 3rd, and then the last one is the 13th, mi, re, which, or in the minor key, mo, re, which is a non-chordal note or appoggiatura embellishment above the 5th of the chord. So just read this text with me. The 5th of the dominant chord, scale step 2 or re, is frequently embellished with scale step 3 or mi, mo, as a non-chordal note. So you can see it here very clearly in figure 6.2. You can do it as an accented passing note, for example. This is in C minor. Here's your supertonic chord as I approach the dominant. So I've accented the E flat. The chord is GBD, and I've said that that is an accented passing note. You can make it an échappé. So you can go to re and then mo, do. 2 different kinds of non-chordal notes that involve the mediant note above the supertonic note. But eventually that mediant note can become emancipated from its non-chordal context, and you can simply go. So the mediant note completely replaces the supertonic note. The emancipation of that dissonance.
Sorry, kan hierdie klip so lank wees as wat jy wil?
Ja,
Okay.
jy kan hulle laat aangaan. So, that means that we actually have different explanations for this thing, because if you look at the notes that we have here, in each case, the structural chord being GBD, and the E flat in each case being this embellishing note, we can say that if you don't use any of the other emancipated dissonance, you only use the 13th. So you've got GB and then E flat embellishing D. It means that while you've got G, G, B, E flat, you've actually got the mediant chord, E flat, G, B. E flat, G, B, E flat, G, B. Or you can say that that E flat is a 13th added into the dominant, and you can say everything is the dominant, and this is dominant. Now notice how you write it in a horizontal line. 13 stroke changes into 5. E flat changes into D. The 13th of the chord becomes the 5th of the chord. And here it is dominant 5, 13. First it's the D, then the E flat. And this is just plain dominant 13. Or you can say this is the mediant chord, augmented mediant chord in first inversion, and it changes into the dominant chord. This you can say is the dominant, which changes into the mediant augmented chord. And then you can say this is just the plain mediant augmented chord standing in the place of the dominant, acting as a dominant 13th. So why is it important that it is in first inversion with a doubled third? Why must it be G, G, B, E flat? Because it's acting like GBD. It is a GBD chord. It's a dominant with an added 13th. That's its important thing. So it's a dominant chord in root position. So if you want to call it mediant, you have to say it's mediant in first inversion with a doubled third, because it's dominant in root position with a doubled root. That's the important thing. So when we have this combination and you recognize, so the first one I'm saying the E flat's just a non-chordal note, so I'm not showing it in the figuring. This one I'm saying call them both members of the dominant chord, and here I'm saying call the first one a mediant chord and the second one a dominant chord, or vice versa. And there it's just a plain mediant chord. It means that when you go mediant changes into dominant, you could say, if you go back to your chapter 5, you'll remember that where you go, not so much from mediant to tonic really, but where you go from mediant to submediant. Remember, we spoke about ornamental thirds as one of the categories of ornamentation in chapter 5. We said you could go from mediant, for example, to submediant. That's what mediant does as a structural chord, remember? Mediant goes to submediant if it's a structural chord. You could simply do that. Or you can use the passing note there. Mi, re, do. You could do that. And if you do that, this chord, which was EGB in first inversion, the E goes down to the D, which goes down to the C in ACE. That means this chord actually changes into GBD. And then we say mediant has an ornamental third. That's one way of explaining this. But in that case, you have to have that descending scale melody, remember? That's how ornamental thirds work. You have to have the structural chord in, with then the ornamental third, the chord that lies a third higher. 5 is 3 higher than chord 3. The fifth of GBD has to act as though it is the seventh of EGBD. And an added seventh EGBD has to come down by step. So the ornamental third progression always has that scale melody. The descending scale melody. So you can see that this kind of overlaps with the idea of the ornamental third over there. It also overlaps with the idea of the appoggiatura ornamental sixth progression, remember, where you could also say the chord is GBD, and what we have is an appoggiatura E flat over there. That's going to tonic or submediant over there. So it's like a non-chordal note appoggiatura embellishment. And the chord is actually GBD. That would be the appoggiatura 6-3, because it's in first inversion, ornamental sixth progression. And the chord is actually dominant, going to tonic. So that, remember, we spoke about that, these overlapping categories in dominant, in the ornamental chords A document. So here we have a slight overlap with that same concept in the particular case of the dominant and its relationship with the mediant, excepting you can go one step further now and you can leave the dominant out completely and you can just use the mediant. But then remember, you are using it as a dominant 13th in root position, so it has to be in first inversion and it has to have a doubled third so that it represents the dominant chord in root position with a doubled root. Okay. Here are a couple of examples that you can look at. Here is a Brahms Geliebter Waltz. I've said here in this excerpt, the penultimate chord marked with an asterisk has been figured as mediant in first inversion, functioning as dominant 13th. And then I ask, what alternative explanation can be given? Well, actually, no, it can't. Okay. Then we've got the dominant 7th, G, F, B, D, G, B, D, F. And then the last chord in that bar is G, G, E. And then it resolves to tonic. So you can look at those two together. GBD changes into GBE. And you can say the E is like a sharp A. It's GBD. And the E is a non-chordal note. You could say that. That's the alternative explanation. That it's all a dominant chord. Or you can say dominant changes into mediant, which is equivalent to a dominant 13th. All right, here's a D minor example. Schumann. And then it goes again. There, supertonic E, G, B flat, and then it goes to the dominant A, C sharp, but not E, A, C sharp, F. So here, chord 3 is standing completely in the place of dominant. A, C sharp, F instead of A, C sharp, E. Re, mo, do. So it's like that one, where there's no supertonic note in the dominant chord at all. So you can call it dominant 13th, or you can say it is mediant 6 in first inversion with a doubled third, acting as the dominant 13th. Okay. Now, the second category and the final category in this chapter has to do with, now remember, as I said, dominant is excluded from ornamental fifths in chapter 5. It's only the predominant chords that get ornamental fifths. So in fact, what dominant does, because it can't have passing 6/4s that fall in the ornamental fifths category, it has its own set of passing chords, unique to itself. And those are based around the dominant quartad. So, Ti, Re, Fa, that's the dominant 7th. The passing notes in between those thirds. So, La, Ti, Do, Re, Mi. The La and the Do and the Mi. Those are the passing notes. Going up or down doesn't really matter. And of course in a minor key it would have to be, because of the raised leading note in the dominant chord, it would have to be a raised submediant note as well. So, La, Do, Ti, Re, Mo, Fa. Those are the basis on which you develop passing chords. Now they don't work in such very strict formulas as the passing 6/4s do, but they still basically work on the idea that if you have a passing chord, remember the passing 6/4s also work like that. A passing chord means that there's a, number one, there's a passing note in the bass. It's the composing out of a passing note in the bass, number one. That's what makes it a passing chord. So there has to be a member of the chord in the bass, then it must go through a passing note to another member of the chord. And that has to move by step. The other notes above it, in the three voices above it, will be a combination of other kinds of non-chordal notes that move by step. So it could be lower auxiliaries, for example, a chordal note that goes down and back, or an upper auxiliary, a chord note that goes up and back. Or I remember, and the other thing that always happens with passing chords is there's always an anchor. There's a note that is common to the structural chord and to the passing chord, the one that stands still. So it'll be that, and then there can also be another passing note melody, like there was with the passing 6/4, going up or down. So it's far more free because you can choose out of those. The point is there are no jumps. You never jump when you approach or resolve a passing chord. That's the general principle. As I said, it's not as set in its rules as the passing 6/4, but still it adheres to the general principles of a passing 6/4. I just want to read a couple of things here. When the dominant quartet is prolonged by the consecutive use of adjacent inversions. Adjacent means inversions that are next to each other. So like a root position and a first inversion, or a first inversion and a second inversion, or a second inversion and a third inversion. When you use them next to each other to make your dominant longer, to prolong your dominant, you can further compose out this with a passing chord on the passing note connecting these adjacent inversions. The passing chord possibilities that result are shown over the page. We'll have a look at them now. So let us have a look at the passing chord possibilities, and then I think this text will become clearer. So I'm taking the adjacent inversions now. Are you on the right place? Adjacent inversions. So I'm starting, and I'm just using C major as my example. And I'm taking the root position in the first inversion, two different options there, and then in the minor key the same, and then I'm going first inversion, second inversion, so I'm going so, la, ti, the la is the passing note, and then I'm going ti, do, re, passing note is the do, and then I'm going re, mo, re, mi, fa, and then the last one goes in the opposite direction actually. It opposite to what I said here. Oh, sorry, wrong page. It's where you connect the so at the top to the re below it, which means there are in fact two passing notes in the middle. So, re, so, fa, mi, re. So the passing chord actually is written to embrace both of those notes, the fa and the mi. And remember that re as a dominant chord can also be the leading tone chord. Leading tone is an alternative dominant really. And it as so happens in this particular progression, the leading tone works better. Alright, so let's just have a look at each of those in turn. So in the case of the so, la, ti bass line, how it works best is if you take the dominant 7th chord. But remember, when you write the dominant 7th chord, you don't have to include all the notes of the chord. You very often, in fact, don't. You write so, ti, and then you leave out re, fa, so. Those are the notes out of which you choose. So goes to do, ti goes to do. Re, if it's there, would go to do. Fa would go to mi, and so would stay on so. So very often you would have to choose between using the 5th or using the doubled root in your dominant 7th. In this particular, because this is 5 notes of course, and you can only use 4. This particular one elects to leave out the 5th. So it goes so, ti, so, fa, and there's no re. Alright, so you've got a so, la, ti, do. So it goes from dominant 7th in root, it goes to dominant 7th in first inversion. But remember, as soon as you go to an inversion of the dominant, as soon as you go to an inversion of the dominant 7th, then you leave out the so, do jump, and you must use all 4 of those voices. So then the re, do does come in. So you'll see that it starts with no re, But when it gets to dominant in first inversion over there, there is a re. So how this works out then is that against the sol, la, ti, first of all you have the anchor note, which is the seventh of the dominant, fa, mi, and then that forms the basis for a la and a fa together, which is the subdominant chord. So it goes, and then so to support that idea, you then have double passing notes. Sol, la, ti goes with ti, do, re, and then you double the root of the dominant over there, and you go so, and then you support the subdominant chord there with another F, and you go back. Okay, that's the one option. And the other option for that same passing note, the sol, la, ti, is that you don't use the subdominant note or the seventh of the dominant as the anchor note, but the doubled root of dominant as the anchor. So you keep the so. Over there. And if you do that, you have a very interesting chord here because it's based on the raised submediant note, A natural. And it has an added seventh, A, C, E flat, and G. So what you call that, when you build a chord on an altered bass note, you have to say it's a raised submediant, so you have to go sharp 6. You call it chord sharp 6 because it's built on A natural in C minor. And then you have to say there's an added seventh, and then you have to look at the chord that you have there. You have an A natural, a C, and an E flat. A, C, E flat is a diminished chord. But the seventh that you add, A to G, is a minor seventh. So that's what we call a half diminished seventh. So it ends up looking like that. Now that is a purely ornamental chord. There's no way that that can ever be a structural chord. You never use sharp 6 half diminished to stand for that chord. That is always dominant in root to submediant triad in root. You never raise its root and you never add a seventh to it. So that proves to you in a way that it is an ornamental chord. So in that case you get parallel passing notes like that. So la, ti goes with ti, do, re, and then you have the seventh of the dominant, fa, mo, fa, in the alto. So it goes. Sorry. All right. So it can be either the subdominant in first inversion or it can be the submediant seventh in root position. That ends up being the passing chord, depending on whether you use the added seventh as the anchor note or the doubled root as the anchor note. Okay, then we continue. You can go ti, do, re, first inversion, passing note, second inversion, and in that case you use the doubled root, the root as your anchor note, and you have passing notes going in every direction. There you've got ti, do, re, then you've got re, do, ti, and you've got a re, mi, fa. So you end up with a no leaps. And then you can go re, mi, fa in the bass. And then you need again the root of the dominant as your anchor note. Re, mi, fa, fa, mi, re, and then ti, do, ti, and then the anchor note, so, so, so. And it must resolve to tonic 6. Why? Because dominant 4-2. third inversion resolves to tonic 6. All right, and then we go to this other one, which connects the doubled root of the dominant. So, re, so, it goes so, fa, mi, re, do, that one. And what it does very often is it is combined with a contrary motion melody that goes so, la, ti, do. So you've got a bass line that goes, sorry, I'm playing this one now in C minor. And I'm going, that's the basis for it. Those two, the scale that goes up combined with the scale that goes down. And again, your anchor note in this case is the 7th of your dominant. You've got a doubled root in your dominant. So, T, Fa, So, no D. And then as you approach that D, you go Ti, do, re. So you bring the D in 2 places. And as soon as you bring the D in 2 places, you're going to leave out the G. So you're going to go so, la, ti, ti, do, re, so, fa, mi, re. And then you've got the anchor note in the middle, fa, fa, fa. So you're going to end up with a re, re, fa, ti. That means you're going to end up with a chord 7, leading tone in first inversion with doubled third, which stands in the place of dominant in second inversion. So it's going to sound like this. But notice what you have to do. If you're in a minor key and you're going from the dominant note, submediant is the passing note, up to the leading note, that is a melodic minor ascending scale. You want a raised leading note because it's the dominant function, so you have to have a raised submediant note as well, which means you've got a subdominant major chord here. In the minor key. Okay, and that's essentially it. You can read the text for yourself in most cases, okay? Here I'm just saying, do you really have to call these, do you have to distinguish? Yes, you do, because there is no such structural chord, for example, as that sharp 6 half diminished 7th. There is no such thing. There's no such thing on this diagram. And in any case, if there was, submediant wouldn't go to a dominant in first inversion. If dominant and submediant are next to each other, they will always both be in root position. So it means this has to be ornamental. It can't possibly be structural, that thing. And that, so it becomes true of all of the others as well. And in any case, you can't go from dominant structurally back to subdominant and then to leading tone. You can't go from dominant back to subdominant. So it has to be an ornamental relation.